In July 2022, the town of Lockwood, Dawson County, Texas, was still steeped in its inherent tranquility. But its residents began to feel an invisible unease emanating from a strange dog farm located deep within the dirt roads. It was the domain of John Kane, a mysterious outsider, and a place that was about to shatter the feigned serenity of the entire region. Perched at the end of a lone, red dirt road, several miles from the nearest residential area, Kane's farm was a bizarre and frightening piece of architecture. It spanned several acres, enclosed by a concrete wall taller than a man, topped with 3 or 4 layers of sharp barbed wire, looking no different from a prison or an impregnable fortress. The large, sturdy iron gate was always sealed shut. No one ever saw it open, except for the rare occasions when a truck carrying animal feed arrived at the crack of dawn and hastily departed. The entire farm was shrouded in an almost absolute silence, broken only by the barking of dogs. But this was no ordinary sound. They were growls, frantic and ferocious barks, full of threat, that echoed off the concrete walls and carried far, making anyone who considered approaching shudder and turn back. The master of that fortress, John Kane, was equally mysterious. He was a middle-aged man who had come from elsewhere. No one knew his origins. He never socialized with neighbors or participated in local activities. Only occasionally would people see him drive his old pickup truck out of the gate, heading straight to town and then returning, his face always cold and emotionless, his sharp eyes looking straight ahead, never glancing or greeting anyone. To the people of Lockwood, Kane and his farm were a forbidden zone, a story embellished with half-true, half-false rumors. But in the end, everyone agreed it was best to stay away. The false peace of Lockwood was truly broken on a sweltering afternoon. At the Dawson County Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant Michael Evans, head of the Criminal Investigation Division, was reviewing a stack of old files when a woman with a haggard, distressed appearance rushed in. She was Mrs. Sarah Miller, who had traveled from a distant state in the Appalachians. Her face was etched with the wrinkles of extreme anxiety, her eyes red and swollen from crying too much. She nearly collapsed into the chair opposite Lieutenant Evans's desk, her voice trembling and lost in fear as she pleaded with the officer to save her daughter, explaining that her daughter was missing. Lieutenant Evans, a man in his late 40s with a high forehead and the calm eyes of a seasoned investigator, gently placed a glass of water on the table in front of the woman. He knew that in situations like this, his own composure was the best sedative for the victim's family. In a deep, warm voice, he asked her to please calm down and to tell him everything clearly from the beginning, including her name and her daughter's name, and how this had happened. Mrs. Miller took a deep breath to compose herself and began her story, her voice punctuated by choked sobs. Her daughter's name was Emily Miller, 22 years old. Emily was a good, dutiful girl, the sole hope of her family. They were poor, and her father had passed away early. Mrs. Miller had single-handedly worked to put her daughter through community college for an accounting degree, hoping she would have a brighter future. After graduating, Emily found a job at a small company near home, but the meager salary was not enough to cover living expenses and medication for her frequently ill mother. About a month ago, through a job search website, Emily was overjoyed to find a job posting. A large dog breeding farm in Texas needed an accounting assistant, with room and board included, and a starting salary of up to $3,500 a month. It was a figure the mother and daughter had never dared to dream of. Mrs. Miller sobbed as she recounted how happy her daughter had been. She explained that Emily had told her she would work far from home for a few years, save up some capital, and then come back to open a small shop so they could be together and her mother would not have to struggle anymore. She said the owner's name was John Kane, who had sounded decent and kind over the phone. Mrs. Miller had been very worried about a young girl working so far away alone, but Emily was so determined and grown, so she had reluctantly let her go. Lieutenant Evans listened intently, jotting down every detail. He asked when the last time she had contacted her was. Mrs. Miller replied that it had been 3 days ago. On the morning of May 12, 2022, Emily had called to tell her she had arrived. She had said the farm was huge but a bit deserted and remote. Her voice had sounded a little strange then, not as cheerful as when she was at home. When her mother asked, she had just said she was probably tired from the long trip. She mentioned that the owner, Mr. Kane, had picked her up and arranged a private room for her. She had promised to call back to tell her more after she finished unpacking and rested a bit. But then, Mrs. Miller waited and waited, until evening, and she never called. She tried calling her, but her phone was unreachable. She thought maybe the signal was weak in the remote area, so she tried to be patient. But then one day, and then 2 days passed, and her phone was still silent. A mother's intuition told her something was wrong. Unable to wait any longer, Mrs. Miller had hastily packed a few clothes and taken a bus, traveling nearly 1,000 miles. She went to the address her daughter had given her, the secluded dog farm in Lockwood. But when she arrived, a real fear engulfed her. The giant iron gate was sealed shut, and behind the high wall were the savage, threatening barks of dogs. She stood outside, screaming until her throat was raw, calling her daughter's name and Mr. Kane's name. But the only response was the increasingly ferocious barking. There was no sign of a person. No one answered. Panicked and helpless, she had to seek out the police. After hearing Mrs. Miller's testimony, Lieutenant Evans felt that something was amiss. The story of a young woman losing contact after starting a job in a remote place was not uncommon, but the details of the farm, described as a fortress, along with the mysterious demeanor of its owner, raised deep suspicions in him. He immediately summoned a team of 3 detectives to go with Mrs. Miller straight to Lockwood. The police car stopped about 50 yards from the farm gate. Just as Mrs. Miller had described, the place exuded a gloomy, heavy atmosphere. Lieutenant Evans got out of the car, feeling the oppressive silence, stirred only by the wind rustling through the trees and the incessant growling of the dogs behind the wall. He approached the iron gate and pounded on it with his fist. The sound of metal clanged dryly. Immediately, the dogs inside went wild. They barked furiously, their claws scratching at the iron gate with a sound that was chilling to the bone. It took nearly 15 minutes for the barking to subside, as if someone was commanding them. Then, there was the clatter of a bolt, the heavy iron gate creaked open, and John Kane appeared. He was a tall man, at least 6 feet, with a sturdy, muscular build. He wore a faded, dark blue work uniform, stained with mud. His skin was tanned and weathered. But the most striking feature was his face. A rugged, angular face with thick eyebrows and a long scar running from his left eye down to near the corner of his mouth. And especially his eyes. A pair of cold, emotionless eyes that stared directly at the police officers without a hint of expression, no surprise, no fear. Kane asked in a low and hoarse voice, devoid of any emotion, who they were and what the problem was. Lieutenant Evans held out his badge, stating that they were from the Dawson County Sheriff's Office and were there to verify a missing person report. He asked if the man was John Kane, the owner of the farm. Kane just nodded. His eyes swept over Mrs. Miller, who was hiding behind the officers, but it was just a fleeting, icy glance. The lieutenant then asked if a young woman named Emily Miller had come there for a job 3 days ago, on the 12th. Kane was silent for a few seconds, as if searching his memory, then nodded again, confirming that there had been a girl like that. Hearing this, Mrs. Miller felt a glimmer of hope. She rushed forward, her voice pleading as she asked where her Emily was and if she was there. Kane glanced at Mrs. Miller, then turned back to Lieutenant Evans, his voice still steady and unchanged, stating that she was not there. She had left. Lieutenant Evans asked, his tone becoming sharper, where she had gone. And Kane began to tell a story completely contrary to what Mrs. Miller had presented. He admitted to posting the job ad and that Emily had come to apply. But according to him, after looking around the farm, the girl had complained that the place was too remote and dull, with no internet and no entertainment, so she had changed her mind and did not want the job. He said that she had claimed she could not stand that kind of life. He felt sorry for the kid coming all this way, so he had given her $50 for bus fare and had called a taxi to take her back to the station that same afternoon. The story sounded plausible, but a veteran investigator's experience told Lieutenant Evans that there were fatal flaws in this statement. He asked Kane which taxi company he had called and what the driver's phone number was. Kane frowned slightly, the only fleeting expression of emotion on his face. He claimed he did not know, that he had just called a general dispatch number. Whichever car came, she took. He said he did not make a habit of paying attention to such things. The lieutenant then asked where the room prepared for Miss Miller was and if they could see it. Kane hesitated for a moment but then nodded and led the team inside. The room where Emily had allegedly stayed was in a separate, single-story building. It was a small room, only about 100 square feet. But what caught the attention of Lieutenant Evans and the detectives was that it was unnaturally clean. The floor was polished to a shine, without a speck of dust. The iron bed was covered with a pristine, flat white sheet. Other than the bed and an empty wooden wardrobe, the room had no personal belongings. Not a single hair, not a single fingerprint, not the slightest sign that a person had lived there. It looked like a room that had been prepared, thoroughly cleaned, in anticipation of an inspection. Lieutenant Evans stood in the middle of the room, observing in silence. In his mind, the scattered pieces of the puzzle began to come together. A dutiful daughter in desperate need of money would not easily give up a high-paying job just because it was a bit boring. A kind-hearted boss who gives money and calls a cab for an employee who quits but cannot remember any details about the taxi company. A room cleaned to an unreasonable degree. And above all, John Kane's demeanor. He was too calm, too nonchalant, as if he had anticipated this visit and had prepared a script to deal with it. When the team left the farm, Mrs. Miller was on the verge of complete collapse. But in Lieutenant Michael Evans's mind, a cold certainty had formed. Kane's statement was full of lies. The disappearance of Emily Miller was not a simple incident, and the man with the soulless eyes was the key to this case. He believed that John Kane was directly involved, and that perhaps the worst crime had occurred behind the iron gates of that horrifying dog farm. Leaving the heavy iron gates of the farm, Lieutenant Michael Evans did not say a word, but his mind was in turmoil. The oppressive atmosphere, thick with the stench of filth and death from inside John Kane's fortress, seemed to linger. Throughout the drive back to the station, he just stared silently out the car window at the green fields and the peaceful life of the people of Lockwood passing by. The cruel contrast between the scenery outside and the evil hidden behind those concrete walls made his chest feel as heavy as if a stone were pressing down on it. He knew the intuition of a criminal detective who had been in the profession for over 20 years was screaming at him that this was no longer an ordinary missing person case. Emily Miller, the young girl with so many dreams, had very likely met the worst possible fate. That very evening, an emergency meeting was convened in the office of the Dawson County Sheriff. The lieutenant reported the entire incident, from the tearful testimony of Mrs. Sarah Miller to the tense confrontation with John Kane. He meticulously analyzed every contradiction, every unexplainable gap in the farm owner's statement. He emphasized Kane's calm to the point of insensibility, the unnatural cleanliness of the room, and the deathly atmosphere that pervaded the entire area. He concluded his report by stating to the sheriff, his voice like steel, that he was almost certain the subject, John Kane, was lying. He asserted that the disappearance of Miss Emily Miller was fraught with suspicion, with all signs pointing to Kane and his farm. He proposed they establish a special task force to focus their resources on investigating and clarifying the case. After hearing the report, the sheriff, a man who had also been through hundreds of major and minor cases, nodded in agreement. He understood that in cases like this, with no witnesses and no clear crime scene, the commander's intuition and experience were crucial. What Lieutenant Evans analyzed was entirely plausible. Immediately, a special investigation, codenamed AT-722, an abbreviation for Lockwood, Texas, and July 2022 was officially established. Lieutenant Michael Evans was appointed as the head of the task force, directly overseeing all investigative activities. A team of the most elite investigators and detectives from the county was mobilized. The atmosphere at the Criminal Investigation Division headquarters became more urgent and tense than ever. In the task force's meeting room, a large whiteboard was quickly filled with text and a web of connecting lines. A photo of Emily Miller, with a bright, radiant smile, was pinned in the center as a silent reminder of their heavy responsibility. Beside it was a picture of the number one suspect, John Kane, taken from his residency records, with his cold face and soulless eyes. Lieutenant Evans told the task force members that they were facing a very cunning and well-prepared subject who had constructed a nearly perfect script to deal with them. To break through this facade, he said, they could not act hastily. They needed solid, irrefutable proof to force him to confess. From that point on, all investigative activities would proceed along three main fronts. He picked up a marker and drew three large arrows on the whiteboard. The first front, he explained, would focus on verifying the entire background and identity of the subject, John Kane. He wanted to know who he was, where he came from, what his past was like, the history of the farm, and where the capital came from. All of his social relationships, no matter how small, had to be thoroughly vetted. They needed to paint a complete portrait of this man. For the second front, they had to immediately debunk Kane's lie about calling the taxi. He wanted them to check every single taxi company operating in the county, including independent cabs and ride-sharing services. They were to get call logs from dispatch, check trip histories, and extract GPS data from all vehicles between noon and evening on May 12th. The goal was to confirm whether or not a taxi was called to or departed from the area of Kane's farm on that day. And for the third front, Lieutenant Evans paused, his eyes growing more pensive, describing it as a deep dive investigation. He wanted them to review all unsolved missing person cases in Dawson County and neighboring counties from the last 5 years, focusing particularly on young female victims from other places who were in difficult circumstances and came here seeking work. He stated he had a very bad feeling that Emily Miller may not be the only victim. The order was given, and the massive investigative machine was immediately set in motion. Detectives fanned out in all directions. The work was hurried, a race against time. They knew that with every passing moment, the hope of finding the victim alive grew dimmer. The team in charge of the second investigative front worked most arduously. They did not just make phone calls, they went to the offices of every taxi company, from large ones like Yellow Cab and Uber to small, private transport cooperatives. The investigators meticulously checked every dispatcher's logbook, cross-referencing every trip on the computer systems. GPS data from hundreds of vehicles on that day were extracted, creating a map crisscrossed with moving lights. The work demanded extreme patience and meticulousness. After 2 days of non-stop work, the first results came in. A report nearly 20 pages thick was placed on Lieutenant Evans's desk. The final conclusion was just one short line, but its weight was like a sledgehammer. Between midnight and 2400 hours on May 12, 2022, across the systems of all taxi companies and ride-sharing services operating in Dawson County, there was absolutely no record of any trip with a pickup or destination point in the vicinity of John Kane's farm in Lockwood. Kane's first lie had been exposed. He had fabricated the story about calling a taxi. This proved he was deliberately hiding the truth about how Emily Miller left, or more accurately, the truth that she never left that place at all. At the same time, another team of detectives brought back equally important results. After working with technical units from the state police and telecom companies, the task force obtained the location data from the victim Emily Miller's cell phone. The data analysis showed that at 9:15 a.m. on May 12th, Emily's phone transmitted its last call signal to her mother. The nearest cell tower determined the phone's coordinates at that time to be within a radius of about 500 yards, encompassing the entire area of John Kane's farm. And that was the last signal. After that call, the phone did not move, no messages were sent, no calls were made or received, and no network data access was recorded. Its signal remained stationary in that single location until around 11 p.m. that same day, when the phone was abruptly turned off. And since then, it had completely vanished from the network. This irrefutable scientific evidence completely shattered Kane's fabricated story of the girl getting into a taxi and leaving that afternoon. Emily Miller's last signal was transmitted from Kane's farm. She was there, and her phone never left that place. In the task force command room, Lieutenant Evans stood frozen before the map enlarged on the screen. A blinking red dot, indicating the victim's last location, was neatly situated within the area demarcated as Kane's farm. Next to the screen, the report on the taxi search was laid out. 2 pieces of evidence, one from human testimony and one from machine data, both pointed to a single truth. John Kane was a liar, and he was lying to cover up a crime. The initial suspicion had now become a certainty. The missing person case had officially been reclassified as a homicide, even though the victim's body had not yet been found. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. The concern for the young girl's fate was gradually replaced by a burning anger toward the perpetrator. The portrait of the man with the emotionless face and the long scar on his cheek seemed to stare out at the investigators from the board. A look of defiance and savagery. The task force's mission was now not just to find the truth, but to drag the monster hiding in human skin into the light of justice. The real fight had only just begun. 2 irrefutable pieces of evidence had officially transformed John Kane from a suspect into a deceitful liar. In the task force command room, the atmosphere was both urgent and heavy. The task force had proven that the victim, Emily Miller, had never left the farm, but that was all they had. No body, no witnesses, no confession. They knew a crime had occurred, but they could not prove it. John Kane remained comfortably in his fortress, challenging the entire justice system. The pressure weighed heavily on Lieutenant Evans and his team. He knew that to break the stubbornness of someone like Kane, they needed to dig deep into his past, to overturn every stone of his life to find a weakness. The first investigative front, led by a deputy captain, worked almost without sleep. Their task was to reconstruct the entire portrait of John Cain's life. Detectives were sent out everywhere, following the faintest traces Cain had left behind. They worked with the Lockwood town authorities, digging through temporary residency registrations and land purchase records. They discovered that Cain had bought this large plot of land over 5 years ago with a huge amount of cash. The origin of this money was a big question mark. His business was registered as a sole proprietorship for breeding and training working dogs, but not a single contract had ever been signed, nor had a single dog ever been sold. The farm's entire operation was a closed, mysterious circle. The breakthrough for this investigative front came from a very small detail in his registration documents. Cain's permanent residence was listed in a remote, mountainous town in Montana. A team was immediately sent north to verify. When they arrived and worked with the local police, a surprising truth was revealed. The person in the registration records did exist, but according to the locals, he had left town over a dozen years ago and had never returned. More importantly, when the detective showed the photo of the suspect John Cain to the local police chief, he shook his head decisively, confirming that it was not the man from their town. Cain's record was a fake. He had used another person's information to create a new identity. A comprehensive search was conducted on the National Criminal Database. Forensic experts began comparing the suspect's image with millions of photos in the data repository. After a tense day and night of work, the computer system finally returned a match. John Cain was not his real name. His birth name was Jacob Cain, born in 1975, originally from a county in Ohio. And his past was darker than the task force could have imagined. Jacob Cain had a prior conviction for aggravated assault. 15 years ago, he had served a 3-year prison sentence. The old case file was quickly transferred. It told a story of his brutal nature. The incident stemmed from a trivial dispute. A neighbor, while backing up his car, had accidentally knocked over Cain's barbed wire fence. Instead of talking it out, Cain had silently gone into his house, emerged with an iron pipe, and without a word, smashed it into the neighbor's leg, shattering the victim's tibia and leaving him with a permanent disability. At the trial, Cain showed no remorse, sullenly stating that his actions were to teach the other man a lesson. The detectives also tracked down Cain's old neighbors in Ohio. Their accounts painted a chilling portrait of a man who was wicked from the core. They described Cain as a sullen, aggressive child with no friends and a morbid hobby of torturing animals. People often saw him catch stray cats and dogs, tie them up with wire, and beat them sadistically. He seemed to find a twisted pleasure in inflicting pain on creatures weaker than himself. As he grew up, this trait only worsened. He frequently started fights and assaulted people without cause. After his release from prison, Jacob Cain sold his house and land, then disappeared from the area, cutting off all contact. No one suspected that he had moved south, changed his name, and become a mysterious dog farm owner. The information from the first investigative front clarified the suspect's nature. He was not just a liar but also a man with extremely violent tendencies, a ruthless and unrepentant individual. This further strengthened the theory that he was fully capable of murdering a defenseless young woman. But the most horrifying discovery, the discovery that pushed the entire case into a darker chapter, came from the third investigative front. The team assigned to review old files had been working in a dusty archive room. Hundreds of files on missing person cases from the past 5 years were opened. Behind each file was a fate, a story of pain for those left behind. After days of reading until his eyes ached, a young investigator named Harris suddenly paused at a yellowed file. It was the case of a missing girl named Jessica Lane, 23, from West Virginia, which occurred in November 2020. Jessica also came from a difficult family background, had also read a job ad online for an accounting position at a breeding farm in Dawson County with an attractive salary. She too had happily taken a bus south in search of a better life. And then, after one last phone call to her family to say she had arrived, she had vanished without a trace. Her family had also come here to report it, but with no leads and no suspects, the case had gradually stalled and was eventually suspended. Harris felt a cold chill run down his spine. The coincidence was too strange. The script was almost a 100% match to Emily Miller's case. He immediately reported it to his superior. A new, more focused search was launched. This time, they entered keywords into the system: female, 2025, out of state, missing, job application, farm, Dawson. And then, the ghosts of the past began to emerge. The system returned 3 more results. The first case happened 3 years ago. Megan Taylor, 24, from Kentucky. The second, 4 years ago. Danielle Shaw, 22, from Mississippi. And the farthest one, nearly 5 years ago. Rachel Price, 25, from Arkansas. All of them, all 4 girls, shared the same fateful script. They were all flowers from the poor lands of Appalachia and the Deep South. They were all young, all carried dreams of a better life. They were all drawn by the same promise of a high-paying job at a mysterious farm in Dawson County. And they all disappeared, leaving behind only a final phone call and the endless, desperate pain of their families. That afternoon, in the task force command room, the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Investigator Harris, his face pale, placed the 4 old files on Lieutenant Evans's desk, right next to the photo of Emily Miller. 5 young women, 5 radiant smiles, 5 tragic fates, now placed side by side. A horrifying pattern, a deadly formula, had become terrifyingly clear. Lieutenant Evans stared at those faces, his hands clenched into fists, anger and sorrow welling up in his chest. This was no longer a single murder. This was a serial murder case. John Kane, or Jacob Kane, was not an impulsive killer. He was a methodical monster, a cruel predator who had been setting a deadly trap in Lockwood for the past 5 years. His dog farm was not for business, it was a killing machine, a mass grave that had buried an unknown number of lives. This horrifying truth far exceeded the task force's initial predictions. They were not just facing a murderer, but a demon in human form. Case AT-722 had just been elevated to a whole new level of severity. Their mission was now not only to find justice for Emily Miller, but also for the forgotten victims of the past. And they had to act fast, before that monster could strike again. The task force command room was shrouded in a heavy, frightening silence. The whiteboard had been replaced by a large corkboard, on which were pinned the photos of 5 young women. 5 smiles, 5 pairs of eyes still sparkling with hope, now served as silent testimony to a crime of unimaginable savagery. Each face was a knife stab to the conscience of the law enforcement officers. They were not just facing a murderer, but a monster who had been silently sowing death for 5 years. Indignation surged through each person's veins, transforming into a steely resolve. That night, Lieutenant Michael Evans made an urgent call to report the latest findings to the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety DPS. His voice over the phone was firm yet could not hide the emotion as he listed the name and home state of each victim. He clearly outlined the horrifying pattern in the method of the crime, the violent past of the suspect Jacob Kane, and concluded unequivocally that this was a serial murder case of a particularly serious nature, beyond the capability of a single county sheriff's office. On the other end of the line, the DPS director, a seasoned veteran, listened without missing a word. His momentary silence was enough to show the shock of the information. Immediately, the order was given. Case AT-722 was upgraded to a state-level investigation. The most elite forces from the Criminal Investigation Division, the Forensic Science Division, and other operational units of the state police were ordered to be on highest alert. More importantly, a SWAT team was dispatched to Dawson County to coordinate. The next day in Dawson, a high-level operational meeting was held at the county sheriff's office. Lieutenant Evans, as the one most familiar with the case, stood before a large map spread on the table, presenting the plan for the raid and emergency search of John Kane's farm. Aerial photos, secretly taken by a drone the night before, clearly outlined the structure of that deadly fortress. He reported to the assembled gentlemen, pointing to the map, that their target was an isolated and extremely well-fortified area. The concrete wall was over 10 feet high and topped with dense barbed wire. There was only one entrance, the Iron Gate. Inside, besides the subject's main house, there was a row of single-story buildings, a warehouse, a processing shed, and a large pond. The entire area was a massive crime scene that had to be preserved intact. A SWAT commander spoke up, his sharp eyes fixed on the photo of the fierce dogs. He noted that their biggest problem was not the wall or the gate, as they had the means to neutralize them in seconds. The biggest challenge was the pack of dogs. They estimated no fewer than 20 adult Belgian Malinois and Rottweilers. These were not ordinary guard dogs they may have been trained to attack. If they opened fire, it would create loud noises, lose the element of surprise, and could provoke the subject to act rashly or destroy evidence. Moreover, it would contaminate the scene. The SWAT commander's question highlighted the most difficult problem: how to neutralize a pack of vicious animals without causing chaos. The room fell silent. Various plans were proposed and then dismissed. Finally, after consulting with an expert from the K9 unit, a bold and sophisticated plan was devised. They would not confront the dogs head-on. Instead, they would use powerful tranquilizer darts fired from nearly silent, specialized air guns. 4 of the best marksmen from the SWAT team would be positioned in high vantage points. On command, they would simultaneously fire tranquilizer darts into the dogs on the outer perimeter. At the same time, a scout team would use specialized tools to cut a small hole in the fence at the back of the farm and then use large pieces of meat laced with a high dose of sedatives to lure the remaining dogs. The plan required precision, coordination, and courage. The second problem was the subject himself. Jacob Kane had a criminal record for violence and was psychologically unstable. No one could be sure if he had weapons hidden in his house. The assault plan had to guarantee absolute surprise, neutralizing the subject as quickly as possible. The time of action, Lieutenant Evans decided, would be 4 a.m. the next day. It was the time when people are in their deepest sleep and most off guard. That night, all forces would secretly move into position and form cordons. The outermost ring would be responsible for blocking all roads. The inner ring would be responsible for closing in and raiding the target. All actions had to be carried out in absolute silence. The plan was agreed upon. The orders were transmitted. A huge machine began to move in the darkness. That afternoon, Lieutenant Evans met privately with the officers of his task force. He did not give grand, heroic speeches. He just silently placed the 5 photos of the victims on the table. He told them that tomorrow they would face a monster, but he reminded them to act not for revenge, but for justice. They were doing this for these 5 girls and for the parents waiting in anguish for news of their children. Their duty was to bring the truth to light, so their souls could find peace. He stressed that their safety was paramount, but the mission must also be completed fully. No one said a word, but a fire ignited in everyone's eyes. It was the fire of responsibility, of determination, and of outrage at the evil. Night slowly fell on Lockwood. A silent night, yet filled with extreme tension. Under the dim moonlight, dark figures moved silently through the paths and fields, taking their designated positions. Each transport vehicle stopped at a distance. The officers, fully equipped with weapons at the ready, quickly dispersed, forming a cordon that gradually tightened around Kane's farm. All communication was done via radios turned to the lowest volume. An entire vast area sank into a deathly silence. At a makeshift field command post set up in an abandoned house about a mile from the target, Lieutenant Evans sat before a monitor connected to all assault teams. Beside him were the DPS director and the SWAT commanders. Time ticked by slowly. 3 a.m. 3:30 a.m. The sky was still pitch black. Evans raised his binoculars towards the dark, silent structure of the farm. From a distance, it looked like a giant monster sleeping. But he knew that within that silence was a living hell. In just a few more hours, the gates of that hell would be torn open. Justice, though delayed, was about to be served. He gripped the radio in his hand, waiting. 4 a.m. The clock hand had just ticked to the fateful number. The night dew had laid a thin, damp layer over the fields. At the field command post, everyone held their breath. On the screen connected to the thermal cameras of the scout teams, John Kane's property appeared like a ghostly painting. The red dots, indicating the body heat of the dog pack, were still moving slowly. A larger, stationary bright spot in the main house was undoubtedly John Kane, fast asleep. Everything was ready. Lieutenant Michael Evans brought the radio to his mouth. His voice, crisp and decisive, echoed in the headsets of all assault teams. He announced that the target was in range and ordered Team 1, the marksman, to execute. The command was barely uttered when, from 4 perfectly camouflaged positions, 4 soft sounds were heard almost simultaneously. 4 tranquilizer darts flew like ghosts, embedding themselves precisely into the thick muscles of the 4 largest Rottweilers. Struck unexpectedly, they only managed to yelp briefly before collapsing onto the damp ground, falling into a deep sleep. At the same time, at the back wall of the farm, a special operations team worked skillfully. They used a small, nearly silent hydraulic bolt cutter to snip through the barbed wire. Through the newly created opening, pieces of fresh beef, heavily soaked in a high-dose sedative, were tossed inside. The enticing smell of raw meat immediately attracted the remaining dogs. They rushed to snatch the tasty bait, unaware that it was the final trap. In less than 5 minutes, the entire pack of ferocious dogs lay motionless in the yard. A scout reported over the radio that the first perimeter was neutralized. Evans replied that it was excellent, his heart pounding. He ordered SWAT to prepare to breach the gate and the detectives to ready themselves to enter behind them, giving the final go-ahead. This time, the silence was shattered. A specialized armored vehicle from the SWAT team, which had been concealed nearby, roared to life and charged straight at the iron gate. The engine's roar was like a waking beast. Crash! An earth-shattering sound erupted. The sturdy iron gate, under the direct impact of the multi-ton vehicle, was torn from its hinges and collapsed inward. Immediately after, a series of small explosions went off as the SWAT team used specialized explosives to blow open 2 sections of the concrete wall, creating 2 more entry points. Like a torrent, dozens of SWAT officers in full gear poured in from 3 directions, quickly spreading out to secure key positions. At the same time, the team of criminal investigators, led by Lieutenant Evans, followed closely behind. Their target was the main house. Inside, John Kane had been jolted awake by the terrifying noise. He woke with a start, not yet understanding what was happening. He simply thought some audacious thief had dared to break into his domain. Rage flared. He grabbed the flashlight and the sharp machete he always kept by his bed, intending to rush out. But before he could even get out of bed, bang! The bedroom door was kicked open by a SWAT officer. The intense beams of multiple flashlights shone directly into Kane's face, blinding him. In that instant, he only had time to see tall, dark figures storming in, the black muzzles of their guns pointed straight at him. A loud voice commanded him to freeze and drop the weapon. John Kane stood frozen. He was not a fool. He knew this was no ordinary visit. He had been exposed. In a split second, his feral instincts kicked in. He raised the machete, intending a desperate resistance, but he did not stand a chance. A SWAT officer struck as fast as lightning, using the butt of his rifle to hit Kane's wrist hard. The machete clattered to the floor. 2 other officers rushed in, tackling the large man onto the bed, pinning him down and wrenching his arms behind him. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped onto his wrists. The entire process, from breaching the gate to completely subduing the subject, took less than 2 minutes. John Kane, or Jacob Kane, the monster who had spread terror for 5 years, was now arrested while still in his shabby pajamas. He did not scream or resist anymore. As he was being escorted outside, he was silent, but his face had turned a deathly pale with fear. His eyes darted around, looking at his beloved dogs lying scattered in the yard and the uniformed police officers everywhere. He knew it was all over. Lieutenant Evans walked into Kane's bedroom. The place was messy and filthy. He did not waste time looking around. His eyes immediately locked onto an object under the bed. It was an iron trunk, an old military-style footlocker, secured with a big padlock. He ordered it brought out. 2 detectives dragged the heavy trunk to the middle of the room. A SWAT officer used a large bolt cutter to clamp down on the shackle of the padlock. With a dry crack, the lock broke. Evans took a deep breath to steady himself, then slowly opened the lid of the trunk. Everyone present in the room, including the most seasoned detectives, froze. A feeling of disgust and profound sorrow welled up in their chests. Inside the trunk was not money or valuables. It was a morbid collection, a devil's trophy case. Dozens of cell phones of all kinds lay jumbled together. Beside them were women's wallets, tubes of lipstick, small mirrors, and cheap jewelry. But the most horrifying items were a stack of driver's licenses and ID cards. Evans put on a pair of gloves and, with a trembling hand, picked up the stack of cards. The top card was Emily Miller's, with her youthful face and radiant smile. Flipping through, he saw Jessica Lane, then Megan Taylor, Danielle Shaw, and Rachel Price. All 5 victims the task force had identified were present. Their IDs had been kept by this demon as a trophy after each hunt. This was direct, irrefutable evidence linking John Kane to the disappearance of all 5 girls. But the nightmare had only just begun. As other teams started searching the rest of the farm, even more horrific discoveries gradually came to light. In the shed used for processing dog food, a place thick with a nauseatingly rank smell, the police found large industrial machines. A massive meat grinder, powerful enough to pulverize large chunks of meat. Beside it was a bone crusher, the type commonly used in livestock feed production facilities. The forensic science officers immediately went to work. Under specialized lights and magnifying glasses, they began to examine every crevice of the two death machines. They found what they both feared and expected. On the blades of the meat grinder, though it had been washed, there were still remnants of old, dried blood. More horribly, when they removed the filter screen of the bone crusher, they discovered tiny white fragments stuck in it. To the naked eye, it was clear they were bone fragments. Lieutenant Evans stood there, watching the two machines as the forensic officers carefully collected samples. A crazy and most cruel hypothesis began to form in his mind. What had Cain done with the victims' bodies? The answer seemed to be right in front of him. An answer so savage that no normal mind could possibly conceive of it. His gaze slowly shifted to the window of the shed, towards the large pond. It still surfaced dark and murky in the dim light of the approaching dawn. The large pond lay in the farthest corner of the farm, its surface stagnant and still. It exuded an aura of death, a haunting silence. From the moment he had set foot on the property, Lieutenant Michael Evans had felt something was wrong with this pond. It was too quiet, no ripples, no sign of fish. Now, after finding the trunk full of the victim's belongings and those two horrifying grinding machines, his eyes were fixed on that black, murky water. A final hypothesis, the most gruesome missing piece in the puzzle, formed clearly in his mind. It was so horrific it made him shudder. But the cold logic of an investigator told him it was the only possible truth. He turned. He did not need to say much. A single look was enough for his closest colleagues to understand. He looked directly at a captain from the state's Criminal Investigation Division overseeing the scene. His voice was hoarse with emotion and rage. He ordered the captain to get 2 high-capacity pumps from the municipal water company immediately. He also ordered another SWAT team to secure the outer perimeter and the entire pond area to be sealed off absolutely. He paused, taking a deep breath, and then gave the final order to drain the pond. The order was given. No one questioned it. Everyone at the scene shared the same ominous feeling. They looked towards the pond, and in each person's eyes was a look of tension, a mental preparation to face the absolute worst. Just over an hour later, 2 large trucks carrying 2 massive pumps arrived. The roar of the pump engines shattered the deathly silence. 2 huge hoses were dropped into the pond. The black, viscous water, emitting a foul stench of mud and decay, began to be sucked up and spewed into a nearby irrigation canal. Time passed slowly. The entire farm area was filled with the steady, monotonous drone of the pumps. The water level in the pond gradually lowered. At first, by a few feet, then 10. The bottom of the pond began to reveal a layer of black, sticky mud. The stench grew increasingly overpowering. When the pumps had nearly drained all the water, leaving only a thick layer of sludge, Lieutenant Evans signaled for them to stop. He put on a pair of rubber boots and gloves and was the first to step down into the pond bed. Following him were officers from the Forensic Science Institute and a team specializing in recovering human remains. The mud was nearly knee-deep, making every step heavy. They used long poles to carefully probe the mud. The space was thick with anticipation. And then, what everyone had feared came to pass. A young officer suddenly froze. He had felt the tip of his pole strike something hard. He carefully followed the pole with his hand, reaching deep into the cold mud. A few seconds later, he pulled his hand up. In it was a bone. A long, ivory-white bone, still covered in mud. It was clearly a human femur. The entire scene fell silent. The young officer's voice trembled as he broke the silence, reporting that he had found something. As if on cue, everyone began to focus on that area. They switched to small shovels and specialized trowels, carefully scraping away layers of mud. And then, the most horrific scene of their law enforcement careers began to unfold. It was not just one bone, but countless. A rib bone, a piece of an arm bone, then a jawbone. And then, most horrifying of all, a human skull, its 2 empty, black eye sockets staring up at the sky. A silent gaze, accusing the killer who had thrown it there. The deeper they dug, the more remains they found. They were piled on top of each other, jumbled without any order. This stagnant pond was no ordinary pond, it was a mass grave, a giant burial pit. The forensic experts worked without rest. They carefully marked the locations, took photographs, and gently placed each piece of bone into separate evidence bags. Based on the number of skulls and major bones found, a preliminary count was made, a number that made everyone's legs go weak. There were the remains of at least 20 different people. 20 people. This number far exceeded the 5 victims the task force had initially identified. It showed that the scale of this crime was much larger and more savage. Lieutenant Evans stood on the bank of the pond, looking down at the hellish scene. He no longer felt rage. Instead, a profound pain, a sorrow for the lives that had been trampled, brutally taken, and discarded like trash. He ordered an officer to gently place one of the recovered skulls into a special evidence box. He knew it was time to confront the demon. The final interrogation took place in a special room at the State Police Detention Center. Jacob Kane, or John Kane, was led in by 2 officers. After a day and night in custody, he looked much more haggard. The cold, emotionless facade had vanished, replaced by an unconcealable panic and fear. He sat down in the chair opposite the interrogation table, his head bowed. Lieutenant Evans sat across from him, next to a prosecutor. He did not rush to question him. He just stared silently at the man. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes, heavy and tense. Finally, unable to bear the pressure, Kane looked up and asked in a whisper what they wanted to ask. Lieutenant Evans did not answer. He just signaled to an investigator standing beside him. The officer brought the evidence box in, placed it on the table right in front of Kane, and slowly opened the lid. The white skull with its 2 black, hollow eye sockets was revealed. When Jacob Kane saw it, his entire body jolted as if electrocuted. His mouth fell open, his eyes bulged, staring at the object as if he had just seen a ghost. His face turned ashen, drained of all color. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his whole body began to tremble uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. Evans asked, his voice slow and cold as ice, if he recognized it. Each of his words was like a hammer blow, striking the final wall of the man's psychological defense. Kane could not answer. He just stammered meaningless sounds, his eyes still glued to the skull in absolute terror. The wall of silence he had worked so hard to build had now completely crumbled. And then, he collapsed onto the table, his hands clutching his head. A wail escaped him. A cry not of remorse, but of fear and despair, knowing that all his crimes had been exposed. He had officially broken. He screamed through his sobs that it was him, that he had killed them, that it was all him. Lieutenant Evans signaled for the stenographer to begin. Finally, after so many days of a tense battle of wits, the monster had bowed his head and confessed. Over the next several hours, Jacob Kane confessed to all of his horrific crimes. His confession was a litany of inhumane and savage acts. He admitted to using fake job ads with attractive salaries as bait to lure young, gullible women from difficult circumstances in distant states. When a victim arrived at the farm, he would assault and rape her. After satisfying his animalistic urges, to cover his tracks, he would brutally murder them. An investigator, his voice trembling with disgust, asked what he did with the bodies of the victims. Kane lifted his face, slick with tears and sweat, a twisted, insane smile suddenly appearing on his lips. He claimed there were no bodies. He recounted, and every word he spoke made his listener shudder. After killing a victim, he used knives and axes to dismember them in the processing shed. The flesh and organs, he fed into the industrial meat grinder, pulverized them, and then mixed them with bran and other feed for his own dogs to eat. He said, his voice casually pathological, that they loved it. It was the best kind of food, which saved money and left no trace. As for the larger bones that could not be ground, he put them into the bone crusher, pulverized them into a fine powder, and also mixed them into the feed. Only the bones that were too large and hard, like skulls and femurs, did he throw into the pond to dispose of them. His confession matched perfectly with everything the task force had found at the scene. The crime was reconstructed in its entirety. A crime for which no words could describe its utter depravity. Jacob Kane did not just kill people, he had erased their very existence from this world in the most savage way imaginable. The confession of Jacob Kane closed the investigative chapter of the crime, but it opened a chapter far more painful and haunting, the chapter of those left behind. The dog farm in Lockwood, once a mysterious location, now became the epicenter of a media earthquake and nationwide attention. News of the dog farm monster case spread like wildfire, sowing shock, horror, and ultimate outrage in the hearts of every American. The scale and savage nature of the crime surpassed all limits of imagination, making it one of the most horrific serial murder cases in the nation's judicial history. The once peaceful town of Lockwood knew no more quiet moments. Hundreds of reporters descended upon it. Drones filled the sky, trying to capture any image from the hellish scene. Curious onlookers also flocked, crowding outside the police cordon, looking in with a mixture of curiosity and fear, whispering about the demon who had lived right beside them for so many years. Inside the police tape, the work of the authorities continued grimly. The best forensic experts from the FBI were brought in. The Pond of Death, after being drained, had become a tragic archaeological excavation site. Every bone fragment was carefully collected, cleaned, sorted, and numbered. A field forensics lab was set up right at the scene. The most painful job was DNA analysis, piecing together the scattered bones to restore identities to the nameless victims. Dozens of families with daughters who had been missing for years flocked to Texas after hearing the news. They brought photos, the last personal belongings of their children, and a sliver of hope so fragile it was painful. They came to do something no parent ever wants to do: provide DNA samples to identify the remains of the very children they had brought into the world. A few months later, the trial of Jacob Kane was held by the Texas District Court. It was a special trial, held publicly at the Dawson County Cultural Center to accommodate the immense public interest. Security was tightened to the highest level. Thousands of people gathered outside, standing under the scorching sun, following the proceedings through loudspeakers. Among them were the mothers and fathers of the victims. They no longer cried; their tears seemed to have run dry, leaving only gaunt faces, numb with grief. They clutched photos of their children, beautiful young women who were now just frozen smiles. In the defendant's box, Jacob Kane stood, gaunt and haggard. He wore an oversized prison uniform. The tall, muscular build of before was gone. He no longer had his cold, emotionless demeanor. He just kept his head down, his whole body trembling, not daring to look up at anyone. The monster, once dragged into the light, seemed to have reverted to the form of a cowardly and despicable human being. The prosecutor's indictment was read out, lasting nearly 2 hours. Every one of Kane's crimes was reconstructed in detailed, damning terms. The entire courtroom was shrouded in a breathtaking silence, broken only by the suppressed sobs of the mothers. When the prosecutor reached the part about Kane dismembering the victims and using their flesh to feed his dogs, a wave of revulsion and outrage spread through the courtroom. Many burst out with curses and shouts for justice. The questioning phase proceeded quickly. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Jacob Kane admitted to all of his criminal acts. He answered questions in a mumbled, disjointed manner. He blamed his unhappy past, his loneliness, his uncontrollable morbid desires. But all those excuses became meaningless in the face of the scale of the crimes he had committed. The most emotional and painful moment of the trial was when the representatives of the victims' families were allowed to speak. Mrs. Sarah Miller, the woman who had started this journey for justice, walked unsteadily to the stand. She did not look at the defendant. She looked directly at the judge and jury, her hands clutching the photo of Emily Miller. Her voice trembled but was clear as she stated to the court that her daughter, Emily Miller, was a good child who just wanted a job to take care of her old mother. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, this monster took her from her. He had not just killed her daughter, he had defiled her body in a way that was unimaginable. For months, she had dreamt of her daughter coming back to her, crying and asking why she was so cold. Now she understood. She stood there not to ask for pity, but on behalf of her daughter and the 19 other families, to demand that justice permanently remove this evil from human society. Only then could the souls of their children rest in peace. Mrs. Miller's words were like a knife to the heart of everyone present. The entire courtroom erupted in tears. The justice of the law could punish the perpetrator, but no sentence could ever compensate for the pain these families would have to bear. After deliberation, the jury delivered its final verdict. The presiding judge, in a stern and solemn voice, declared that the actions of the defendant, Jacob Kane, were exceptionally savage, cruel, and devoid of all humanity. They had caused a horrific tragedy and extreme public outrage. The defendant's crimes were unforgivable, with no possibility of rehabilitation. It was necessary to apply the strictest penalty as a punishment and deterrent for all of society. The court sentenced the defendant, Jacob Kane, on charges of capital murder, rape, and abuse of a corpse, to death by lethal injection. As the sentence was announced, the courtroom fell silent for a moment, then erupted in applause mixed with the choked sobs of the victims' families. Justice had finally been served. Jacob Kane collapsed to the floor upon hearing the sentence and had to be helped by bailiffs to leave the defendant's box. The case was closed. The dog farm was sealed off and then completely demolished, leaving the land barren and desolate. But the scar it left on the minds of the local people and the entire society would never fade. The dog farm monster case became a horrifying lesson about the depravity of man, about the evil that can hide in the most unexpected places. It showed that when empathy and respect for human life are completely lost, a person can become more savage than any beast. The case was also a costly wake-up call about the loopholes in population management, the laxity in connecting information about missing person reports between jurisdictions, and a reminder that vigilance and mutual concern within a community are among the most effective shields against evil.